So this is week 1 with Bowen. I just want to give you guys a head up that yes, I am aware that in these videos Bowen is not at his healthy weight yet, but he was not so underweight that I couldn't work with him. He was about, I think, 900 pounds when I got him, and I immediately got him on good quality hay and grain, and he has put on a good amount of weight since then, and he looks really good. But yes, he was smaller in these videos, and as you see through the next couple of weeks, you'll see how much weight he has gained and how good he looks from then to now. So, of course, I always start with grooming before I do any type of work with Bowen. So, this is the first day I had him. I had him tied up to a tie down. It's basically just a post by a little shed, and it's on some soft ground, but he actually just didn't like being away from the other horses at all. So he ended up breaking my lead rope, and I chased him around this 10-acre property for a good 30 minutes before we even got to work or before I got to do anything with him. And ever since then, it's been working on getting him to stay calm when he's tied up to something. From what I know, he hasn't had issues with it in the past, but I also don't know the extent of the training of this horse. So, of course, with day 1, we just started with desensitizing to the whip. He just needs to understand that it's a tool, it's not a weapon, so you need to be scared of it. He really didn't have a problem with it, but anytime I worked with him, I always did a quick refresher just to make sure that he still understood that I wasn't trying to use it as a weapon. Now, as you see, I went ahead and I took off the whip part and I just have the stick. I don't generally like to use the whip unless I really have to get their attention. Like if there's a day that he really just isn't paying attention to me and I need something to make more of a snapping noise on the ground. Like you can see, he doesn't really like to pay attention to me, and I have to smack the ground a little hard to get his attention to keep him moving. So this is day 1. Generally, he was more worried about his surroundings rather than me. He does listen, but it seemed to take a little bit more like firmness to get him to keep moving his feet or to get him to move in a circle. And it was really hard to keep him moving. As you can see, he just stops every so many steps because he's too worried about what's outside of the round pen rather than paying attention to what I have to what I'm telling him to do. Which isn't necessarily all a bad thing, but when I am working with him, I want his focus to be on me. And at first, that was really hard to get him to understand. He is much older. He's about 10. I thought he was 6 when I got him. So it explains a lot when I found out how he's actually older because he doesn't understand why I want him to do these things or to keep him moving at all. He's just used to kind of being a horse and just eating whatever he wants or doing what he wants, and now he's being told to move a certain direction or, to go a certain speed. But he doesn't show a whole lot of attitude, just a lot of ignoring me. So he showed me a little bit of attitude right there when I asked him to keep going. And he would do that every now and then, mostly because, like I said earlier, he just didn't want to, much less could he have cared that I was asking him to do something. So when I applied more pressure, I don't necessarily hit him with the whip, but I will get closer and I'll wave it over him, but I will never hit him, and you will see that in all of my videos. So this is another good example here for how he doesn't really care about me right now, because as soon as we finished, he just started going to the end of the round pin. Okay, it is now day 2 and I am working on flexion, which he really didn't have a whole lot of issues with. I think at first he just didn't understand what I wanted him to do, but once he realized that I wanted him to just bend his neck in towards me, then he really caught the hang of it really quick, and he's probably the easiest horse I've ever taught how to do this. So that was a really good bend, and I always give lots of love. I rub all over their neck, their chest, just as the reward. I don't really like to use treats because then it makes the horse a beggar for treats, and then they end up being really pushy. So I'm going to work with yielding the hindquarters, and eventually I'll work with yielding the forequarters of the horse today. I always like to do this pretty soon in the training just so that I can get them moving their feet better and kind of teaching him how to move properly so that it can translate under saddle better. And he catches on really quick, and he's eager to learn, which was a blessing. And he also caught on pretty quick, even though sometimes it would take a little bit more convincing to get him to do what I asked. So with day 3, we started again with some more flexion with both sides, which he did really good, of course. And then I started just kind of desensitizing him to me jumping around him. And as you're about to see, he jumped pretty hard the first time I ever did it, which was expected. So with day 6, I jumped right into doing just some more round pin exercises. As you see, he's still not super worried about me. He would have good days and bad days. Some days he's like, okay, yeah, I'll pay attention. And other days he's like, yeah, I could really care less. He's a pretty lazy horse, um, but he would eventually do what I ask as long as I stayed firm about it and consistent. I used the lead line, in order to teach him how to turn in towards me. And he was pretty slow to understanding what I was asking him to do, but eventually he got smoother and smoother at it, and he really started to get the hang of it. So right here we actually got hit with a dirt devil, which I'm really glad that he didn't spook over, and even with the tarp flapping in the back because we hadn't quite gotten that far yet. But initially I saw it coming and I thought it was going to be a bad experience, but thankfully he did what he was supposed to. He kept doing what I asked, and even though I stopped, he slowed down, but when he realized that I still wanted him to go, he picked back up into his trot and he kept going, which was exactly what he should have done, and I was very proud of him for that.
Come on. Good boy. Come on. Now. So close. Hold it. Malfunction. Good boy. Whoa. 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 There you go. There you go. Good boy. Stand.
He didn't really like to stand still, as you saw. I got him to a stop, and then when I approached him, I petted him for a second, and then he was like, "Oh, I'm ready to go again." But he needs to learn that when I tell him to stand, that he needs to stand. And eventually, over time, he gets better at that command as well. I felt like today was a good day to start desensitizing him to the saddle blanket, the saddle pad, and the saddle. Uh, and he didn't do horrible. He did snort a little bit, and he did back away sometimes, but he was mostly curious about it. He did follow me around with it in my hand, and he sniffed it, and when he did, I'd pull it away, or he'd nibble on it. So he wasn't horribly scared of it or really that frightened of it either. He was just more or less curious about each item.
Not gonna hurt you. Good. Good boy. I'm gonna play with it. See? He's so good. looks funny, huh? Way too big.
I let him do a lot of sniffing, and of course I waved it over him, and now I'm just working up to actually putting it on him. I always pick up the stirrup on the other side because I tend to have an issue with like the stirrup getting stuck under the saddle, and then I know that's just uncomfortable, so I try to prevent that. And also, I'm pretty gentle when putting the saddle on. I know that most people like to put it down a little bit harder, but this is a pretty light saddle, so I felt like it was fine. And plus, with his back being so bony, I really didn't want to cause any damage. And I did let the stirrup just kind of drop because I wanted him to start to get used to that feeling that the stirrup is not a mean thing. And now, of course, I'm just going to start adjusting the cinch and getting all of that set up that way he can start getting used to that feeling. And he did really well. I am very satisfied with the way that he took everything on this, even though it's just day 6. And he just doesn't really seem to care that anything is on his back. He does fine. I mean, he got a little nervous when I pulled the cinch over, but he quickly realized that it wasn't something to be frightened of, which was great. And he really did a great job. He was very patient. He stood there the whole time, and he just let me do whatever I needed to. And the cinch really didn't bother him at all. As you can see, he didn't have any reaction at all to the cinch touching his belly for the first time. So I had him run around with the saddle on. Just wanted to see how he would react to the stirrups flopping around and touching his belly and just him having something on his back. He didn't even buck or throw his head or any sign that he didn't like the saddle. He really could have cared less. He even loped with it on, as you just saw, and he did really well. And even at some point, a hay string got stuck to the stirrup because I guess it was caught on the round pin fence, and he just kind of drug it around, and he really didn't care. Um, he did so well. I'm very proud of him, and I'm really satisfied with the way that he had reacted. Um, it was pretty shocking because he tends to spook over the littlest things, um, but he did really well with that. So my next step was to start applying pressure in the stirrups and pulling on the saddle. I put the helmet on just in case he decided to bolt and I possibly got like stuck in the stirrup or something, or just in case he kicked me or anything. Um, just good to be safe about it. And he did fine. His ears are pointed back at me. It just means that they were paying attention. And he did a lot better when I was jumping around him this go round and holding onto the saddle. He did want to kind of walk away. I think he just didn't really know what I wanted him to do. So he's still kind of just learning, which is fine. He figured it out eventually that I just want him to stand.
Good boy. Good boy. Yeah.
So I do like to be able to mount on either side, even though I generally just get on from the left. But just to be sure, I always like to make sure that he could handle both. In case I'm in a situation where I have to mount on his right side, and it's better to have them trained for both just in case. But this is just how I like to do it with mine. And he did really well. He seems to do better on his right side. He really, it's just I think a lot of it is he's lazy. And I think at this point I gained a lot of trust with him. So he's not as worried about what I'm going to do. And I did decide that I wanted to try to mount, but I wasn't aware at the time that the saddle was not really fitting him correctly. And the reason he bolted was because my stirrup actually popped off and it fell out of its setting. So that spooked him. It wasn't me actually pulling on the saddle. And that's why I had a hard time mounting because my stirrup slipped. But after that, I just walked him around for a minute, calmed him down. Then I went and I grabbed the chair and I just kind of laid across him just to kind of reassure him that, I wasn't trying to hurt him earlier and it was an accident and he was fine. He didn't really seem too traumatized for it. Another good thing is he doesn't really care about dogs either because my boys go to the barn with me and he doesn't really care that they're there, which is another good benefit.
Good boy.
Day 7 was pretty interesting. So I pulled him out, groomed him, did a quick little warm up in the round pen, and then I tacked him up like you see in the picture. I did put a bridle on him for once with my split reins, and he didn't really care too much about the bit. Like you can see, like he was eating and doing whatever like normal things that he wants to do, but he did play with it a lot. Mostly because he'd never had one in his mouth, which is it's pretty expected with a horse that's never had a bit in its mouth. Um, but I was just kind of walking him around and he spooked over a little orange sign that was blown across us, and he pulled back so hard that he actually snapped the leather on my split rein that was like holding it together. So that was interesting, but yeah, so he broke my split reins. It wasn't really a bad day. It was pretty relaxed. It was mostly just getting him used to having tack on and seeing how he would do with a bridle, which he did fine, and it wasn't too bad. So, but that was the end of our first week.